All right. Well, welcome. My name is Rachelle Schlosser Lynn, and I am the Vice President of Interior Design for Walsh Bishop Associates in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I am a practicing interior designer with a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Interior Design. This practice of sustainable design has been something that I've been doing for about 14 years, and it's something that I have really integrated into my design process from the beginning. And so it's become something for me that it's just an everyday practice, and there is no difference between, there is no reason why I would ever do something for a client that would not be sustainable because they didn't ask me to. So what it is for me at this point is I have certain clients that want me to push the envelope further, so I've worked on several demonstration type projects where we're actually trying new technologies, and the client is willing to take the risk. And then I have all of my other clients where I do as much sustainable design as I possibly can for them, and that's just the way it is. So we were very fortunate when we decided that we wanted to do sustainable design. We were fortunate at that time that we had clients that came to us that wanted us to do these demonstration projects very early on, and so we were somewhat paid to do some of the research, which helps because I think today's marketplace does not necessarily afford, clients aren't necessarily paying their design teams to be doing sustainable design research at this point. So I feel very fortunate that we were able to start such a long time ago. And then we've also done several research papers together that have been published, and I have been speaking to lots of groups of people, from my peers to clients and to students. One of my other things that I do is I actually am on the adjunct faculty at the University of Minnesota, and I teach in the College of Architecture to undergraduate students an entry-level course on sustainability in architecture, and trying to teach them at a very early stage in their design career on what sustainable design is, and helping them recognize that as young professionals they will be able to teach a lot of us new things, and that they need to use that as one of their selling tools as they go out and find their first jobs out in the marketplace. So that's a little bit about me. What we're going to talk about today is getting outside the box from an interior design perspective, thinking about integrated design and the importance of integrated design. Why is it so important? How does an interior designer play into that? Talk a little bit about, a little bit more specifics about material choices and how that impacts an overall design solution. And then I have some case study project examples that I thought I would show you. Hopefully the slides are going to be okay. I apologize. I did look in the book and everything is in there. So as best as you can, you should hopefully be able to follow along. I would welcome you to interrupt me if you have questions as we go along, or we can wait until the end. So however it works for you, I'm comfortable either way. So I have a couple questions for you. First, I was wondering who is all here. How many interior designers are in the audience? Okay. Architects? Engineers? Contractors? My favorites are the developers? No developers? Okay. How about students? All right. That's great. How much experience do you all have in practicing sustainable design? Would you say that how many are really experienced, high-level experience with sustainable design? Okay. How about kind of middle, or how about if we just go to low? How many are just kind of low-level experience with sustainable design? Okay, great. So as I talk today, you know, one of my philosophies of sustainable design, and as we all get to spend some time with Bill McDonough, one of my favorite people, I think if you've read the, oh no, I'm going to forget what it is, the little book that I usually carry with me all the time, but the Hanover Principles, thank you. Step number 9 that we are all supposed to practice as environmental stewards is that we share our knowledge. And so that is one of the reasons why I'm here today, is to make sure that I share what I know with you, and then I would like you all to share with me what you know as well. So my quote to start it out is our ideals, laws, and customs should be based on the proposition that each generation, in turn, becomes the custodian rather than the absolute owner of our resources, and each generation has the obligation to pass this inheritance on to the future. I found this quote. It's different than most of the other quotes, but it's the same theme, that our job here today is to try to do what we can as environmental stewards to protect the environmental resources that are out there for the future generations. And I think that I like the way that this one was written, and it was written in 1971, which I think is also something worth mentioning. So, go ahead. The design process that we're all familiar with, generally we have the pre-design programming phase, schematic design, design development, construction documents, bidding, negotiating, and construction observation. The greatest opportunity for us to have an influence on the sustainable design success of the project is going to be in the pre-design phase. It is very difficult in some cases, it's very difficult for the design team to be really engaged in the pre-design process. Which is why it's important to make sure that our clients truly understand what kinds of decisions are made in pre-design so that they know what kind of an impact they're going to have. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the state of Minnesota guidelines, but we almost created another design phase before pre-design because in a government type project they always have a pre-design phase where they do hire design professionals to do the pre-design. But they've already also done a whole pre-design exercise on their own usually, where they somewhat come to the table and decide that they definitely need to build a building, or they definitely need to move, or this space is just not going to work for us. So that's kind of the phase I'm talking about, and there's a lot of things that can be gained at that earliest conversation by having different design professionals at the table. We've had a lot of experience where our peers will come to us, or a client will come to us at about the end of design development or construction documents and ask us if we will step in and do some sustainable design consulting. Could we review the documents for them and help them figure out what kind of sustainable design strategies they can bring into the project? What happens is the later in the process that they are in the design process, the harder it is to bring new ideas to the table, and the more expensive it's going to be. As designers, we know that if you're already into construction documents, you're already detailing the design, the last thing that you want to be doing is going back and resiting the building so that it's sited for proper daylighting. And so it's really important that we look at the early phase. We've gotten to the point now where we just can't. We don't feel that the impact that we would make on a project in a construction document phase or even design development is worth doing unless the client is clearly educated on the fact that they will have to almost step back and redo a significant portion of the design phase at that point. Some of the other things that I've noticed is I had an experience where we have a developer client. It's the Port Authority of St. Paul. They own a lot of land. They had come to a firm that I worked at previously and asked us to start laying out the site just to have as a marketing material for them that they could show to potential businesses as to how the site might be laid out, where their facilities are going to be. This is an industrial park, and it's a brownfield site that they're redeveloping. So one of the landscape architects in our office took the opportunity to start doing some sketches, figured out how the road's going to be laid out, how the site parcels could be divided up, dealing with the industrial traffic that would be coming in, so on and so forth. And this graphic used to sit right in front of me, and I would just sit and look at it all the time thinking, how the heck did that happen? Because all of the buildings that he cited on that particular site, they worked great with the roads and site circulation, but they were all oriented in the wrong direction for optimal daylighting. And it brought to the forefront that, of course, the landscape architect and the civil engineer would be most appropriate people to be doing that activity. But it reminded me of how important it is to sit down and have conversations with them that I, as the interior designer, that will be someday designing the actual interiors of those buildings that are going to go onto the site, why it's important to me that I have buildings that are sited to maximize daylighting. Now, this is just purely a marketing tool. It wasn't for real, It was just something that the developer was going to take out there. How many of those marketing drawings have you seen that become real? As soon as it looks good on paper, that's what they built. So, we had some really good dialogue about just reminding people that these are the kinds of opportunities that we all need to take responsibility for. And even and that's the beginning of cross-disciplinary training, of me understanding the landscape architect's job and the landscape architect's understanding what my job is. Some of the things that we're going to talk about and interior design issues that are needing to be considered are listed here, and we're going to go through each one of these in a little bit more detail. The first one, I think, that I've touched on a little bit already is to have an appropriate program and to really spend the time doing a space needs assessment, understanding that how is the program being developed and who is actually developing the program. Is your client based on hierarchy or is it based on actual needs? Understanding how the program itself will impact the overall resources that you're going to use on that project. And then once you understand some of that, to be able to sit down with the client and help them understand how they might change the way that they're thinking about their program. We've seen, and I'll show a case study of a project where we actually went in and helped the client understand a lot better about why they were programming spaces that were significantly larger than what they needed to be. And so we went in and we said, what do you actually do? We talked about furniture solutions that can actually reduce the size of an office space but yet still give you all of the things that you need in your office. We reduced the size of the building enough that we were at a certain cost per square foot. By reducing the size of the building, we increased the cost per square foot. We reduced the size of the building. We had the same budget, but because I had more dollars per square foot, I was able to do a lot more sustainable design strategies that were above and beyond what would just be typical. So programming becomes pretty important at the very early stages of a project. Okay. Go ahead. As I mentioned, the state of Minnesota has actually written our own sustainable design guidelines. They're called Buildings, Benchmarks, and Beyond. And it is not a restructuring of the LEED documentation. It's actually a completely different guideline tool. How many people here are familiar with the Minnesota guidelines? I am one of the authors that helped write the guidelines, and the difference, it's very transparent to LEED. The guidelines are required for all state-funded projects in the state of Minnesota as of January 1st, 2004. All state-funded projects over 5,000 square feet that has 2 utilities. So if it is truly a storage building that only has electricity, they wouldn't be required to follow the guidelines. Had it gone into place a few months earlier, projects like the new Guthrie Theater that we have in Minneapolis and the Walker Arts Center addition that we have recently opened would have been required to follow these guidelines because they have state monies that went into them. So it's the difference between the Minnesota guidelines and the LEED guidelines, I guess, would be that we are more focused on performance and performance outcomes, and versus LEED, which is much more prescriptive. Here's the list of things to do, check them off, you get so many points, and then you're certified. Here, almost all of the guidelines are actually required, and we're trying to measure true environmental outcomes of each of the different strategies. This one that I want to talk about is one that, it's a concept that is talked about. I've already talked about it a little bit, but we wrote it down formally. And we called it planning for conservation. It's one of the strategies. The idea is to try to maximize the utilization of facilities and modify them less over time by careful analysis of needs and resources. These guidelines are primarily used by state office agencies. So as I mentioned before, they have the kind of design phase that we decided to create is we called it agency planning. So agency planning is the phase that comes before the pre-design phase, where the state agencies are all getting together and talking about what their needs are. And so we wrote this guideline more specifically for them to guide them through a process of understanding how they're analyzing what their true needs are for their facilities. So this is almost the entire guideline. You can find more of the guidelines on the website, which is the CSBR, universityofminnesota.edu/B3. The questions that we want them to really sit back and think about are, can your existing facility, what we want them to do is there are a lot of state buildings. Before we automatically build new state buildings, is there a chance that we can swap people around? Is there an agency over here that has a certain amount of space that has outgrown that space, so they need to move to another one, and that agency might be downsizing, and so we could move them around? In the last 6 months, the government has changed a lot. There's been a lot of mergers of different departments and agencies, and so there's a lot of people moving around town, and we're hopeful that they have taken some of this into consideration as they think about what their space needs are. It just seems like the model that they use generally is very hierarchical and not necessarily thinking about some of the overall environmental costs of resources. So one of the people that was on our guidelines team was a finance guy, and his job was to try to take the actual economic costs, real hard dollars, and then trying to translate them into environmental costs so that we would look at what the community costs are, because if we build new buildings, what does that mean to the water system and power systems and all these different resources that we might need. We wanted to look at, try to figure out what global warming potential might be, a much bigger picture of outcomes that we were trying to measure by working through these processes. You can go to the next slide. And the idea was that there's documentation that goes with each of these guidelines, and the state agency at this point would be writing up the documentation that shows that they went through some sort of a process telling us what kind of process they went through and showing different spaces that they looked at. And then it coordinates with some of the other strategies within the guidelines, meaning that going through this means that you should also go back and look at the materials and waste section, because there will be a cost savings, again, from the environmental side. Using less materials will factor into the materials and waste calculations, and so there's some coordinating that needs to happen between these two things. And then also looking at the overall energy. If you look at the overall embodied energy that's required for buildings in general, whether it's just interior remodels or new buildings, we also wanted to make sure that this information was being logged into the energy section so that we're taking advantage of the overall embodied energy savings by reducing the amount of space that they actually need. Thinking about the daylighting and lighting from, again, as an interior designer, a lot of our job is to try to help our clients try to find space, whether it's an interior space or as we're looking at new buildings. And I think that, again, that partnership between architects, interior designers, and the other disciplines that will be involved in the project is really important. And one of the most important aspects of sustainable design, I think, in the office environment, schools environment, is the view potential from the inside to the outside. And so as you're out either looking at existing spaces or if you are planning a new facility, to be there thinking about it as you are standing within that space and what the potential is going to be. It's very important for people to be able to look up from their desk at different periods of the day and see what's going on outside, see what the weather is doing out there. There are many studies that have been done that are in the works and have been done that deal with the productivity aspects of daylighting and the views to the outside. As you're looking at existing buildings, it's important that as you're walking through the space, look at the potential of daylighting. Is it good daylight? Try to visit the space at different times of the day. What kind of daylighting controls do they have? Is there opportunities within that building to look at occupancy sensors or daylight sensors? Some of the buildings tend to have very stringent requirements, and it seems to be, I find it most often in Class A office space, surprisingly enough, where they are very strict about what types of lighting fixtures they want in their building, what types of lamps they want in their building. And I can understand it from the standpoint of a building facility management process, but it's unfortunate when they are standardized on a particular light fixture that isn't the best quality of light for the people that are actually going to work in there. So looking at buildings to see if you actually have the opportunity to make changes like that. Is the office building going to require that you stick to a 50-foot candle or more light level, or will you be able to actually reduce that? Again, because experiences that I've had, they're worried about the streetscape, kind of what does it look like from the street as you're looking up into the office tower. and how will that impact it? We all know that you probably don't need 50-foot candles to do your job. Ambient level, you can probably get by in a well-daylit space with 20 or 30-foot candles, and then you provide adequate task lighting for the person at their desk. The more people are on their computers, the less light that they actually need as an ambient. And then if you have your daylighting controls, of course, on a cloudy day, if you needed more than that, the light levels could go up higher. One of the things to be considered is what are the energy savings potential in each of these buildings that you're looking at. I've been doing a little bit of research in Minneapolis actually, thinking about doing a research paper where we would take the Class A office towers downtown and do a comparison from an environmental standpoint, looking for kind of a competitive edge maybe for the property owner and the developer, and what we could bring to the table, and trying to figure out which of the office towers would be easiest to meet a LEED commercial interior certification, and then so that they could then market that to their potential tenants. It's like, well, you've built these buildings within the last 10 years. How many of them are actually energy efficient enough? How many of them have appropriate daylight? And kind of go through the checklist of LEED CI and figure out which ones are already almost there for a LEED CI certification, letting the building owners then market that appropriately. I'm not sure if we're actually going to be able to do that research project, but I think that it would be a very interesting set of information out there. We're looking at, if we can't do it across developers, we have at least one developer that would be interested, and they own 6 buildings in the downtown market, that we could at least do a comparison of their 6 buildings, which would be very valuable information. Looking at the open office versus the private office, open office partition heights. This is a common thing that happens all the time. Generally, a building is being built. There may be, this would be a situation where there might be an architecture team that's separate from the interior design team. Building is built. They've done all these wonderful sustainable things. They've made sure that it's very well daylit for the office environment. Interior design team comes on board, and the first thing that happens is offices go up along the perimeter. That's one thing that could happen that blocks all of this great daylight from coming into the core. The second thing that happens, which is probably more common, is they'll put the workstation furniture up against the glass, but it'll all be at like 66-inch high panels. So you have just shut down this process that, a lot of energy modeling went into modeling how much energy is saved by all of the daylight that you brought in. You have talked about workplace productivity and what the benefits are going to be for the employees that are sitting in the further away from the windows, and how wonderful this daylight is going to be for them. And then all of a sudden you just come in and you put solid panels in. Fortunately, what I've seen in the furniture side is that a lot of the furniture manufacturers are now coming up with ways that if you need that higher privacy, that at least we can look at ways to create transparent panels with the stacking panels, so that if you are going to have a panel, that at least the top ones could either be clear and or kind of an opaque glass or a polycarbonate type material. So we're getting a little bit closer to being on the same page as far as trying to solve that privacy issue and the daylighting issue. But it's another thing where if the team that might be designing the building and the team that might be dealing with the furniture solution are not in coordination with each other early on in the project, you've lost a wonderful opportunity. It's important too, I think, that as you are doing that programming exercise, if the team is working towards, if part of the team is really focused on the daylighting aspects and energy savings part, and the other part of the team is over here working with a client that is telling you how important privacy is and acoustics, that they actually do need private offices, and that they do have issues where they want private offices to be up against the glass, anything like that. The two sides need to be talking to each other so that you design a building that is meeting the actual needs of the client, and yet you can also find a creative way to meet the sustainable design goals that the client actually wants you, to look at. From a material and finish standpoint, some of the same things start to come up as we look at probably the most important aspect of materials and the indoor environment of an office space is air quality. And this is an area where I've probably spent most of my time doing research is on the air quality issues related to the toxins emitted from materials and finishes. So there are many cases where you walk into a building and the standard palette has been set, and they hand you your guidebook and they say, these are the materials and finishes that we expect you to use in this space to maintain that Class A office feel. And it'll include things like vinyl wall covering. They may have a specific paint that their painter likes to use. It may be that they won't allow you to leave concrete exposed. They may have certain adhesives that they want used for different applications. They may do on-site finishing of wood products, you know, the doors and things like that. These are all things that are really important to be asking the questions as you're out looking at space so that you can understand what the impact is going to be from an off-gassing perspective. And trying to talk with building owners as you all take on projects where you might be the ones setting up building standard finishes to truly look at what the emissions are of the products that we're specifying. And the human health aspect of air quality and the toxic emissions of materials is just it's something that we can't avoid anymore. It's the one aspect, and it's probably because it's the one thing that I know more about and that I'm more passionate about is just human health. People talk about what's important to you from a sustainable standpoint. Is it energy savings? Is it resources and recycled content and being more efficient and reducing waste? Or is it kind of the human health? And that's where I've spent most of my time, and I would always prioritize any choice that I would make on human health before I would look at any of the other things. Yes?
We recently had a client ask us to give them specifics on that topic, and we were having a difficult time coming up with measurable documentation about how creating a green environment, if you will, affects productivity and human health. Are you aware of statistics or documentation?
There is new research that is coming out, and there is one of the guys that is on our guidelines team has participated in some of that. His name is Jim Wise, and he's from the state of Washington. I'll have to look up his contact information, but he was able to show us some of the research on productivity issues. So I think that it's really important to understand, one, if you're going into an existing building, what the building standard material palette, what you are being expected to work with, and whether or not you think that's an appropriate building for your client to move into. And I think that we will shortly be moving into a period where as more new buildings are being built, office towers or other that are meeting maybe a LEED core and shell or are more environmental, and they are out marketing to tenants that they are a more sustainable, healthy office environment, the existing buildings are going to kind of have to go back and reevaluate how they are marketing their space as well. I'm hopeful that that will happen within the next 5 years. That might be still wishful thinking, but the other thing to think about is looking at materials that are manufactured close to the site. Thinking about, when I think about materials, and this building is a good example, and you think about what type of building or client are you working with? Is it a law firm that's going to be in a Class A office tower, or is it going to be, you know, a company like Steelcase that is going to go into more of a warehouse type building and fit it out as an office and classroom space? Is it an industrial user that is going to build an industrial building? Who are they? What are they? What's their thing? What kind of brand identity are we going to bring to them from an architectural standpoint? And how does that factor into sustainable design? And so as you think about regional materials, which is important, I think the less that the materials have to travel to your site, the better. It also brings back kind of that regionalism. So maybe we can recognize when we're in the Midwest versus when we're in California versus when we're in Florida, would be kind of a nice thing. So as you're designing the building and you're looking at the overall architecture and structure of it, and you're looking at the regional materials that are available to you, how does that start to play into what the interior aesthetic of your building is going to be? What do you want to project from an interior standpoint? How can you coordinate early on in the project with the structural engineer and the architect, and then bring in mechanical and electrical engineers as well, so that you're all on the same page about how much is going to be exposed, what types of materials are there, and really taking a look at things like what do we have available to us from a regional standpoint, what types of materials do we want to use if we're going to use wood, what kind of wood might be most appropriate again for this region, is it FSC certified or not, and you have to make the choice, is that more important than using one that's right in your backyard, you know, and things like that. Looking at air quality again, and making sure that you're asking if there have been any air quality complaints within the building. Have there been a lot of issues with the mold is a big deal these days, and just overall, you know, air quality. Do tenants complain when tenant fit-outs are being done next door? And what is the building management actually doing to address that? Are there materials within the building that could be used for reuse? And fortunately, office towers are pretty good about this. They don't throw everything away. They usually stockpile the doors that are in the building. They might stockpile light fixtures because they want you to keep using the same light fixtures. So I think it's really important to make sure that you kind of go through a salvaging exercise within the building to see what is already readily available to you within the building. Using salvaged materials is very complicated, and we have done it several times, but issues that come up with it are, do you have a place to actually store the materials? So a lot of times we'll go out, we'll first scavenge the building that we're going into to see what we can find. They already have storage, it's already there, we'll tag it, make sure that we get it. From there we'll go out and we'll start looking at the salvage yards and see what else we might find. We found all kinds of things. We found beautiful pieces of slate that we've been able to incorporate into reception desks. So something like that is relatively easy. We can go to the yard, we tag it, the contractor goes and buys it. He can find a place to put that for the time that it's going to take to build out the space. The bigger the item, the harder that gets. So if we go out, and one time we went to the yard and we were looking for windows. All of the offices, this happened to have a lot of private offices, and they were all going to be in the core, and they all wanted to have windows, side lights and other larger windows, so that they would draw some of the daylight into their space. So we went to the salvage yard and we found a bunch of windows. We took inventory. We do this at the very beginning of the project because you have to figure, you might as well know from the get-go how big the windows are, what kind of a module you can come up with for your interior elevations, and work with it from that standpoint. It only worked in this case because the suite next door to us was empty. So as we brought in 50 windows, we were able to store them right next door. If that had not been available to us, the strategy probably wouldn't have worked. We've had situations where we have tried to reuse structural materials, which has been very successful for us. And again, it has been because we've had a place to store them actually on site. So I like using a little bit of salvaged material and a little bit of new stuff, because generally you can't tell the difference from one to the other. We'll bring in, you know, if you have to do a break room, we'll go back to the yard, and they've got all this kitchen equipment from commercial kitchens like restaurants and stuff. So you just go in there and pick out your stainless steel sink. It's beautiful. It just didn't work in that restaurant anymore, and you pull it back and you put it in. Clients that want lockers in their showers, a lot of people want showers. You go to the yard, you find a bunch of stainless steel lockers, or we've gone to the school districts that, you know, if we hear that they're remodeling, we'll go to the school district and just say, do you have some lockers that we could take, or file cabinets that we can grab? You know, you do a little bit of repaint on them, and they're good as new. So using salvaged materials just requires that you take enough initiative at the beginning to go out and look for it. And you have to factor that into your design time. So I always say schematic design, that's a lot of sketching on paper, also now includes a trip around town or a few phone calls to see what kind of salvage materials might be most appropriate to your project. And it starts to become part of your concept development, which is, I think, really exciting. As we all go out, halfway through design development, or we're thinking about what kind of materials and putting together our palettes and things like that, we all go out and you look at different showrooms, or you've got your library. This just requires a little bit more work because you might be going to more or less a junkyard to find things that you might want to use in your project. So it can be a lot of fun, but it is a little bit of work. The other thing to think about that we've run into is building code issues. In the project that I was talking about with the windows, we had a pretty serious problem at the very end. And it always seems to happen at the last final walkthrough when something is going to go wrong. The building official is going to wait until the very last minute to tell you that there's been a problem. What happened was the windows that we use are always exterior windows that are now being used as interior windows, but they're just thin and they're not tempered glass, and they don't have all those safety features that we would typically have in an office space that we would do with our new glass side lights. It's not a problem, they're fine, except when you put the glass too close to the door or you put it too close to the floor. And it was just one small thing like that where the code official came in and we were within inches of being code compliant to the closeness to the door on just 2 of the windows. So it wasn't a huge deal, but it was big enough that we would have had to demolish the walls, take out the glass, and redo the whole thing on those two offices. So you scramble really quickly to figure out how are you going to solve the problem. And we found a safety film that is used a lot at gas stations, actually, that you apply to a piece of glass. It makes it bulletproof. So we went from a piece of glass that's going to shatter to bulletproof within a matter of days. And everything was fine. But, the building code official was still, we had to produce a lot of documentation to show that that particular product was going to meet the needs and the intent of the building code. So there are things about using salvaged materials that you still need to be very cognizant of the actual building code requirements. As I mentioned before, building use and appropriate material palette, thinking again about what are the actual needs of the client in an environment like this. Obviously, acoustics are important. But do you really need to put in a drop 2x4 ceiling tile in this space? Or if you know about it early enough along and you want that daylighting strategy to work with you, that you can figure out a way to put the acoustics up in the deck, maximize the amount of daylight that we can draw into the space, and deal with your acoustics problems from a different angle. Sometimes you have to just do it the same old way. But for me, thinking outside the box is assuming that the space will not be sheetrock with carpet and drop ceiling tile. That's kind of where I start every project, regardless of what building I'm in or what my client is. And my goal is to figure out how to build spaces that will meet the intent with using as little material as possible, and thinking about material use in a completely different way. And if I were back in school and doing a master's thesis, I think I would do an entire thesis project on what is a wall and what is a wall intended to do for us, and how could we build a wall differently than with just studs and sheetrock and still meet all of the intentions of our clients' needs. So meeting acoustics, meeting privacy, whatever their actual needs are, to assume that not every single wall has to be insulated sheetrock stud wall. Yes?
You haven't talked at all about the use of modular products that could be reused. Have you explored that very much?
We have to some extent. We have not had a user yet where the modular systems have been cost effective enough. So because we don't have enough, we have had a lot of tenant type clients where their churn is not there because they're not staying in their spaces long enough to use the modular systems.
We're trying to adopt that on a lot of different projects and use the modular elements as much as we can that could be picked up and moved and reconfigured.
Have you done, she's asking about the modular office wall systems and...
Kind of modular products.
Well, we've created some of our own modular ideas. So we'll do exposed studs, and then we'll put a wall material on it so that it could be taken apart a lot easier. We're doing things like that. We do that a lot, actually.
That literally mean modular products
Yep. Yeah, I think that's really exciting, actually, to just kind of rethink how we put the walls together so that they can be easier to take apart. And I think, most importantly, just to say one more time, is to make sure that we're only using what is actually needed on a project. And again, this comes from the premise of everybody kind of starting from the fact that every piece of concrete flooring has to have a finish on it. So if it's a room like this, a classroom, okay, it might need carpet from an acoustical standpoint. If it's in the bathroom, does it actually need ceramic tile, or can you put a sealer on the concrete that still meets the health requirements? If it's in the, in the lobby of the space, does it need to have, whatever the finish might be? Is that actually needed? And to think about that on all surfaces that you're actually working on. Does the wall actually need to be vinyl wall covering? Why does it need to be vinyl wall covering? It needs to be there because it's going to be more durable and they won't have to paint it as often. Is there another way to create a finish on that wall that doesn't necessarily mean that you're applying a vinyl finish on top of something else? Is there another product to be considered that you could use as the actual wall material that wouldn't require two materials to be glued together? There's a couple of topics that have been raised already today that I wanted to just talk about very briefly. Biomimicry, cradle to cradle, and then some of the tools that kind of go along with this as we're thinking about the material and finish selection. As we look at, want to go to the next slide? Biomimicry, which we heard a lot about this morning. Well, we heard a little bit about this morning. How many people here are familiar with biomimicry? It's just, I'm most excited. The University of Minnesota has been spending a lot of time with Janine Benyus, and we're trying to develop an actual curriculum around biomimicry where we can put together the engineering disciplines and the architectural disciplines and the interior design disciplines, and then trying to create a product like an industrial design studio that would help develop some of these biomimicry ideas. And knowing that the idea is to just try to look to nature as a model and what can we do differently from an interior design perspective, I think is really exciting. I think about this as I'm trying to make choices about whether it's the furniture or the materials that I'm using. And there aren't a lot of products out there today that we can say, this one is a biomimicry product, especially on kind of the architectural and design side. So, we got a long ways to go. But as you're brainstorming with sales reps and different product manufacturers that are out there, and you're starting to look at their different materials, it's like, okay, well, how could we redesign this particular product to be more of a model, using nature as our model? So I just think that there's huge potential in this area. The next slide has the spider example, and it's always the one that I think of the most, is that if a spider can create the strongest fiber in the world without using any chemicals, why can't we do that? And how long is it going to take? So obviously they are working on it. So how long is it going to take before that comes out? And what's it going to look like? The other thing that Janine talked about at one point that actually made me really nervous if this really did happen was she was talking about the chameleon effect of finishes. That imagine, I don't know where she was going with this exactly, but instead of having carpet per se, you'd still have a flooring treatment. And I don't know if it was soft or hard, but you kind of pour it out of a bottle, and it goes out to the edges. It goes to where it needs to be. It'll be releasable, so you'll be able to take it back out when you're done with it. But instead of it just being this tan, it would actually be more like a butterfly. So when it comes out, it might be brown, like a butterfly, but as it actually has light coming in, the space will change over time. So the reason it made me nervous was because as we spent all this time trying to coordinate our interior palette, I'm thinking, what are we supposed to do with a kaleidoscope butterfly on the floor, and everything else that's going on? But it was just it was an interesting idea to think that something like that could be developed. And thinking then about wall covering, and that we don't all want just flat paint. I mean, that's one of the beauties of wall covering. Wall covering is beautiful. It brings texture to the space. It brings dimension to the space. So just flat paint doesn't really always suit the needs that we're looking for. So imagine the releasable wall covering, you know, so you can do something to that wall still, but it's easy to take it off and find another use for it. So I just think that there's a lot of research that can be done in this world of biomimicry, and as creative people and designers, I think it's up to us to keep gelling these ideas around in our head, and as we have the opportunity to meet with product developers and other inventors and scientists, that we put those ideas out to them because they'll actually figure out how to make it happen. So let's go one more. On the cradle to cradle side, and everybody here familiar with cradle to cradle, I'm sure. This is one where I'll just give a little bit of background on my kind of really short synopsis of the cradle to cradle. The basic idea is that as you're developing products, the idea is that the product, the object that will be created will contain technical nutrients, biological nutrients, and hopefully no monstrous hybrids. So what we're talking about is that if it can be deconstructed and taken apart, the technical nutrients will just go back into the manufacturing process and can be reused to manufacture the object again. The biological nutrients can just be thrown out, and they can go back into the ground to provide the nutrients that the ground actually needs and be a very good source that way. The problem is that most everything that we have today falls into the category of monstrous hybrids. So as we look at different products that are being made, I think that we need to be looking at whether or not they are pushing themselves more towards a cradle-to-cradle model. An example that I ran into recently was that a lot of the textile companies today are creating textiles that can be recycled. So beyond just being recyclable, they are now on to the cradle-to-cradle model. Textile can be recycled. So you specify that. You pick it because of that. That textile is no good to anybody until you actually apply it to a chair or a sofa or, you know, something else. You have to know whether or not the manufacturer is going to glue that textile to the foam, or whether they're going to figure out another way to do it so that it can actually be released, so that it can in fact go back into the food chain and be reused down the road. And so there's a lot of, you have to think way far ahead when somebody comes in and tells you about their cradle-to-cradle product that they've developed, and whether or not it truly is cradle-to-cradle because of how it's going to be connected to other things. So, you know, we've seen some cradle-to-cradle carpet, we've seen some cradle-to-cradle textiles, we've seen cradle-to-cradle task seating. Is it truly cradle-to-cradle, and to truly understand where they've come and how that comes to be? So that's easy to think about when we talk about products. And as a designer, it's probably an easy place to be because it's not my responsibility. I just have to be responsible for picking the right material. So take that to the actual building and the architecture that you're working in. How do you, as a designer, design a building or an interior space that follows the model of cradle-to-cradle? And if any of you participated in the cradle-to-cradle competition that went on last year, where we designed a house in Roanoke, Virginia, it was a phenomenal process. And in our office, we did a 16-week charrette. The best thing about the whole project was that we met every single week. Different people on our staff would come to the table and present areas of expertise. So they might talk about, somebody would be designated the site expert, somebody else would be designated material expert. And we designed this house in a way that it was as close to cradle as we could possibly imagine. But it was a long ways from actually being cradle-to-cradle. We learned so much in that process, and the complexity of thinking about designing a space to be just technical nutrients and biological nutrients without being monstrous hybrids was really hard. And it goes to a lot of modular thinking. So again, drywall that has to be screwed in and taped and sanded isn't the right answer. But yet it's a good solution for a lot of other reasons. So how do you get what you want out of sheetrock without necessarily having to tape and sand it and glue it all together? And that's where I think the opportunity is for us, again, to think about our designs. And you have to do this early on. Concept development schematic design. Your client, in most cases, if you sit down at the table and say, I've got this really great idea, it's all based on this cradle to cradle thing, and you start going there, you're probably going to lose them. So this is the part where if you like being creative and you need your creative juices, infused, you take this stuff on your own. And you start to sit at your desk and say, I have a really great idea of how we can create walls that are cradle to cradle. Or, I just came up with this really cool idea of how I could model something after nature. And take that and keep it, and even if it's just you and your design team, that's the place to start, I think, of getting people really excited about these concepts and figure out a way to share it with our clients without speaking in our usual design jargon that just might be a little bit too frightening for them. So to me, this is a huge opportunity for us to I don't know, think outside the box and spend some time being creative again, which in some cases, especially over the last 3 years with the recession, has not given us a lot of time to be as creative as we wanted to be. Yes, you had a question.
What about the problem then of ensuring that cradle to cradle actually happens when it's time to recycle that material? If you run into a brick wall, because the people that were creating these materials aren't there at the end of the life cycle.
We've talked about that a lot in our guideline process of the state of Minnesota. We almost wrote it into the guidelines, but we didn't. If you truly are, let's talk about a building first. If you're truly designing a building that is for the 50, 75, 100-year life cycle, we definitely won't be there when the next life is supposed to start. So we've talked a lot about, is it the responsibility of the design team and the owner to do a full set of design documents? You've designed it for deconstruction or salvaged or whatever. Is the phase after construction documents, maybe it's being done during construction, is your phase at that point to do the deconstruction drawings? And that just as our set of construction documents gets logged at the city, depending on how historic your building is, those plans are kept for a long time. Should those drawings also include the deconstruction drawings? And the habit becomes, it gets passed down, that these are the drawings that you need to go to when you want to make a renovation in this building, versus just having the construction documents. I don't know. I think it's a great idea. I don't know that we can all get there. Do we, as designers, take responsibility for that first? See how long does it take to create a set of deconstruction drawings, assuming that you already designed it to be deconstructed? So how much money does that really cost your client? That's where it has to start. I mean, somebody has to try it and do it a few times and then see whether or not you can pitch that as an actual service. It will also have a big difference. It'll depend on who your client is. Potentially, maybe if it's the government, they might be more open to that because, in theory, they might own the building a lot longer than just a typical private user. From an interior standpoint, if you're working on tenant spaces, fees are less. Well, you can make decent fees, but your speed is much. It's more about speed, getting the design done, the thing built, getting the tenant in there, more so than probably anything else. But should you, because a tenant may only stay there for 5 years, maybe 7, maybe 10, that's where the greatest waste potential is. And so, to me, there's almost more of a reason to spend more time trying to figure it out on kind of the tenant improvement market than even on new buildings. Can we do that? And can we actually design tenant fit-outs that can be deconstructed easily? Can we convince property managers that they should be thinking beyond just salvaging the ceiling tile, the light fixtures, and the doors? And, maybe there's a reason why they could be keeping more pieces. I don't know. But that's, to me, is one of the ways that we kind of gelled around how you make sure that it actually happens. There has to be documentation that kind of goes with the space. You turn it over and you say, here's your owner's manual from an architectural standpoint of how to take it apart. A couple of the tools that we use on a life cycle analysis, kind of the next level of thinking about what we do as we're selecting our materials is thinking about the overall life cycle analysis. And this, we use Athena and we use Bees. Athena is a tool that is it's a bigger modeling tool, and it's more about getting at structural elements than it is to get into the inside of the space. What we intend to use it for in Minnesota is we want to use Athena models and create actual typical construction building types that designers can use that will allow them to look at true environmental impacts of that particular building type. So we'll have concrete and steel, probably have wood, we might have precast. I'm not exactly sure which building types we're going to have, and we'll do them of varying sizes of buildings so that a design team can truly understand what the environmental outcomes would be from a global warming standpoint. You know, how is it affecting the community again? How is it affecting water quality? All of these things. What we want to do is use that, and that again will be mostly just the structural elements. In an ideal world, it will then be able to be used as we start layering on all the other components of the building so that we could get an entire building model of the environmental impacts of all of the choices that have been made to put that building structure together. So we're working on that. It's going to take us a long time to get there. We've already been working on it for a couple of years. It's very complicated to do. But until we truly see, and this is where, like I mentioned, Minnesota is very focused on the performance outcomes versus the prescriptive. So instead of saying that you should absolutely use materials with recycled content and FSC wood and regional materials and all these other things, that what we really want to do is put the whole thing together and see what those choices, if those choices are the right choices from an environmental standpoint. So that's kind of where we're trying to head with Athena. It's a great tool. Life cycle assessment, I guess I should step back a little bit to just talk about that. What we're really trying to get at is a true analysis of how building materials are made. So we look at things like, where did all the raw materials come from? What are the raw materials? Where were they extracted? Where were they extracted from? How do the raw materials get to the factory? Where is the factory? What kind of shipping is used to get from the extraction point to there? What kind of shipping is used to get from the factory to the distribution point, from distribution to your actual project site? Looking at energy that's used to actually power the plant. Do they have any renewable energy sources? And then looking at, so covering all that stuff on the front end, and then also looking at the back end of what happens to the material when it's at end of life. How do we get it back to the beginning again? And we use a tool that Drew Meadows actually created. It's an environmental questionnaire that she had written. We've modified it a little bit, and I use it primarily to make choices on all of my finishes. And so I've given it out to a lot of our manufacturers' reps and asked them to kind of go through the process of, if I'm looking for a task chair and it's steel case, then I say, can you go through your list of task chairs, fill out this questionnaire, and let's look at what the results are so that I can then compare it to other task chairs and see which one has, is going to garner a higher environmental score based on the different elements of environmental measurements.
You mentioned that you participated in a number of research projects, and were you using Athena or Bees as part of this research to build the resource library?
She's asking if we've used some of these tools in our research projects. We are using Athena now just on the Minnesota guidelines and seeing how we can use that particular tool to help us do more of a whole building modeling. But other than that, we have not. We have not. And Bees has actually come a long ways. I've used Bees myself on projects for quite some time. If you're not familiar with it, the website is here. It's a great tool for then getting kind of deeper into the material finishes, and the database is taking a long time to get loaded with information, but there's enough information in there now that you can get some good comparisons between different flooring materials or wall type materials that will tell you what the environmental impact is, and it goes through some of that life cycle assessment that we were talking about and gives you some good information. So they're both I think good tools, from an interior design standpoint, I would use bees more so than I would use Athena. And the state of Minnesota was, I did not work on this project, but this is the state of Minnesota life cycle tool that was created, and this was a research project on its own. And what we did in this case was you looked at all of the materials. So you have Athena, big model, big building model. Then you go to bees and you get into specifics about should you use carpet or should you use linoleum. That's about as far deep as it goes. This was intended to take you then to the actual manufacturers. So you've used your bees tool, you've decided that carpet's okay. Now you're going to actually do comparisons between 3 or 4 or 5 different carpet manufacturers, and it will then break it down and tell you what some of the environmental outcomes of that choice was. So this one, if you can see the website, it's also it's www.buildingmaterials.umn.edu. And this is a fairly new tool, but it's the one that we've probably heard designers ask for the most. There are a lot of tools that are out there that get you to more of that higher level thinking, but what you need is eventually you need to go to your resource library and actually pull up the material that you're looking for. Okay. Talking a little bit more about materials emissions and design, construction, and operations and maintenance. The idea being that we need to reduce the amount of indoor pollution as much as possible. When you're using the LEED guidelines, there are a lot of standards that are out there that are, some of them are required by LEED. This has become, again, for us, a lot of these guidelines are ones that we've been using for a long time, ever since they actually came out. And we started probably with the state of Washington guidelines when they first came out as being kind of a base criteria for us on choosing which materials or which furniture we actually wanted to use for our projects. So these are very helpful. We are very fortunate that over the course of the last 10 years that you can now go to GreenGuard or Green Seal and the materials are listed. 10 years ago, when I wanted to know what the chemical makeup was from one material to the other, I had to look at the material safety data sheet, and I had to start to learn what the chemicals were, which chemicals were good, which chemicals were bad. It was really hard. And I would try to give presentations to designers and say, these are things that you really need to know about the emissions from carpet. So these chemicals are bad. And people would just look at you like, I cannot take time to look at chemical makeup of every material that I'm using. So I'm very excited to know that we can go to Green Seal and we can go to GreenGuard and we can feel very good about the fact that research has been done, scientists have looked at them, and they've passed a standard. There are people that will argue the good and the bad between GreenGuard and Green Seal, but at least it's a place to start. And if you really don't want to know the behind the scenes, you don't have to. But it's better to go there and make a choice than to just start with your resource library of everything else that you have. So that is all important, that you need to do that during your design phase. During construction, there are things that are very important. This, again, depending on the project type, can be more challenging, and especially when you're doing tenant work, office fit-outs, because of the time constraints. You're lucky if you're getting the 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe 10 weeks to build the space out. So generally, we're not getting what we want, which is a 2-week period where the space just sits empty and the off-gassing can occur. It just doesn't happen, which only goes to say that it's even more important for us to take responsibility for picking materials that are not going to off-gas in the first place. The other thing to think about is the sequence of installation. And if you can have an influence at all, is to try to work with the contractors on the sequencing. There's the sink capacity of different materials that we use. And it's important that things that are wet are installed prior to things that are dry. So it would be more important for the paint to go on first and the carpet to go in second even though that is always done in reverse. And the reason is because if there are going to be toxins emitted from the paint and they will come out into the space, they will be captured by things that are within that space that can capture those toxins. So something like a carpet or an upholstery or a window treatment or the ceiling tile, anything like that that has the ability to capture elements that are in the air, they will. It's not an easy thing to do, but it's, I think, always a worthwhile conversation to have. It generally means that the painter is going to have to come back and maybe do a little bit more touch-up if there is paint in the space, but it's important. And then the operations and maintenance piece, again, thinking about durability of the material from the beginning and then understanding how it needs to be maintained and then making sure that the person that actually is responsible for cleaning it gets the instructions. I can't tell you how much linoleum I've specified and had installed on projects only to show up after the fact and they've completely ruined it. Whether they decided because the guy was so used to vinyl tile that he came in and he buffed the thing, or they tried to wax, they put the wrong wax. It has come to the forefront that no matter what, you have to talk to the actual person that's going to clean it, because I always give it to my client, and then somehow or another it doesn't get to the person that needs it the most. So there's still a long ways to go. I think we've learned a lot about the care of materials and being much more cognizant about the choice that we make and not having to use toxic cleaning materials, but still need to get to the actual person that takes care of it. All right, so I'd just like to show a couple of projects that I've worked on. The first one that I want to talk about is Eagles Point Wastewater Treatment Plant, and it's an operations and maintenance office building. And it's probably one of the projects that I'm most proud of as an interior designer. Because the way that it works when I used to work in an architecture and engineering firm, these types of buildings are always designed by the engineers. They don't need an architect until someday when they might need some sort of, I don't know, exterior wall section, or maybe they need a building section, but they definitely don't need your input because they already know that it's concrete block and it's going to have, a flat roof and it's going to have a couple of windows and, that's it. So this building, and I've always wanted to work on one of these buildings. So I was very fortunate to finally have, it's a design build project. An engineering and construction firm was on board. Within their 3-inch thick 3-ring binders, there was one paragraph in the RFP that required them to do something about sustainable design on this particular campus. And so they happened to call us and say, we need you guys to be a sustainable design consultant for us. And I said very boldly that we will definitely be your sustainable design consultant on this project as long as you let us design this building. You can design the rest of the campus, but we want this building. So they kind of thought about it for a while, and they agreed. And so finally I had the opportunity to work on an industrial building and show a client what is possible to do on a wastewater treatment plant. So this building was 88, it was about 9,000 square feet when we started. Because it was design build, the contractor actually did design the building for the proposal. So they had a 9,000 square foot building, concrete block with a rock face finish on it and a burgundy band, and a few windows and a flat roof. Drop ceiling inside, sheetrocked walls on the inside perimeter of the building. Pretty typical building. Very boring and very plain. And we had, this is the one where we worked with the cost per square foot, and I think we were at $120 a square foot for a budget. So it was okay. It wasn't that bad. So this is the one where we first stepped back and we said, from an environmental standpoint, the first thing we need to do is look at ways to reduce the energy needs for this building. The building was set, that was already decided where it was going to be, and it was set so that it would be running, the long way of the building would be north and south, so that the most sun exposure would be on the east and the west side. So the opposite direction of what we wanted it to be. But we couldn't change it. So we decided to cant the building just as much as we possibly could to try to minimize that as best as we could. We then sat with the client and we talked to them. We talked to the actual users of this building. We found out that there are only 6 people that will ever occupy this building. And of the 6 of them, 2 of them are out in the plant most of the time. 2 of them have offices at a different plant. And 2 of them will actually be in the office. So we had it nailed down to the fact that there really are only 2 people that will be in this building on a regular basis. Brought to the forefront, how important can acoustics be in a building where there's only 2 people that are in there all the time? So we started thinking about that. We started asking them questions about, what do you like about working at the plant? What do you like about your job? You know, just trying to really understand what life is like when you work at a wastewater treatment plant. We reduced the amount of square footage on this project by 1,000 square feet. So I went from my $120 a square foot to $150 a square foot. We made it clear that we were not going to reduce the budget. We just were reallocating our funds. You can go to the next one. We went for 100% daylight in the building. And the way that we did that was we did, you know, windows. You could see it kind of on the outside. We had the windows along the perimeter. And then we also did a little bit of daylighting in the common hallway because they were, even though there were only 2 people, they were set on the fact that they had to have private offices for all 6 of them, plus they had a lab, and that was okay. You know, we thought, well, there are no open offices in here, it's only private offices. So we brought the daylight into their work environment and then tried to just make it a little bit more inviting for the people that would be touring. This project was designed right before 9/11, so it was designed also with the intention that a lot of school children would be able to tour the facility. And unfortunately, you know, that is not possible anymore. So we had to make it conducive to having 60 children in the building at the same time, just for the general tour. So we did do the 100% daylight, and we made sure that it was very energy efficient. We used a lot of energy controls, daylighting controls. The design of this building was such that we reduced our energy needs by 70% over building code requirements. And the way that we actually did that was by using the effluent tank that is on the plant. So what we did was we started out by thinking that we were going to do geothermal. So of course we were going to get our heat source out of the ground. We realized that the site right around this building was a little bit too tight for us to get the number of wells that we would actually need. And so we started brainstorming, what's another way to get geothermal? You can go to a water source. We started thinking about hydro because this is right on the river, but the river was too far away from this building. So the next best source was this effluent tank. It's always at 55 to 65 degrees. So it had the constant temperature that we needed. It was, unfortunately, one building further away than it should have been. If we had been involved in master planning, we could have made sure that it was adjacent to the building. So it cost us a little bit more to run the pipe over there. But 70% reduction in energy use just because we did that one thing, combined with the daylighting and the daylighting sensors that we were able to use on the project. So we used a lot of our extra money that we got to do that, and it was well worth it. The other thing that we did is we went down the path of not using using materials that were more appropriate. So we used a precast panel. We wanted to do a poured concrete because that's what the rest of the plant is. It's actually, most of the buildings on a wastewater treatment plant are poured concrete. We wanted to fit into the neighborhood more so than be different. So the rock face concrete block to us didn't really fit into the overall aesthetic. So we did the next best thing, which was a precast panel. But because we wanted the smoothness of a poured concrete wall, we reversed them. So we installed them backwards. So the ribbing of the panel, because it was a ribbed panel on one side and smooth on the other side, we put the ribbing on the inside, and we said, now we have an interior finish. We don't need to do anything. So there was no need to fur it out and put sheetrock on it. It gave a texture that we would like to have on an interior space, and we didn't have to paint it or anything else. We did use sheetrock for the rest of the office walls. We have a lot of glass. We didn't have the budget to pay for a lot of glass, so we used polycarbonate where we could, and took advantage of bringing daylight in using that material instead of all glass. And in our energy modeling process, that was not a problem. It did not reduce our energy savings because we used polycarbonate instead of glass. And then we looked at, just overall material use of what do we really need on the floor, where do we need floor materials, and where do we not. And we didn't put in acoustical ceiling tile because we don't have a need for acoustics in this particular building. So it was what was interesting, this is the actual effluent tank. So the pipe runs in through this tank, and that's where we are capturing all of our energy. The interesting thing about this client was it's the Metropolitan Council that manages the wastewater treatment plants in the cities. And they decided, because they wanted to really show off to the commissioner that they had done sustainable design on this project, they went and asked for more money. We said, we don't need any more money, but that's okay. You can go get more money. So they went and got some more money, only about $150,000. So it wasn't a lot, but it was enough. And then we had to itemize. What did we do from a sustainable design standpoint that's worth $150,000? It was the hardest exercise that I've ever been through, because what we did was we reduced the amount of square footage. That didn't cost us $150,000. It saved us money. We reduced material use because we didn't buy sheetrock and we didn't buy, vinyl wall covering, and we didn't buy acoustical ceiling tile. That was a money saver. So everything that we kept writing down was a negative number that wasn't adding to $150,000. And so we really struggled with putting the report together. I mean, we used our geothermal geoeffluent system, which cost us about half of that amount. We put towards the $150,000. But a lot of the other things, we really had to make a case for how was that a sustainable design strategy, and how do you account for that? The daylighting, the shape of the building with the pitched roof instead of a flat roof played right into a daylighting strategy. But it didn't cost us any more money than having just the flat roof necessarily. It was slightly more, but it wasn't enough to put it on the list. And to put it on the list of things that we did from a sustainable design strategy, that's not what they wanted. They wanted, the recycled content carpet and recycled paint, and there just weren't enough of those items to add up to the 150. So that was kind of an interesting exercise on their part. The last slide for this project actually shows the back end of the building, where this is their maintenance shop. And we also made sure that we looked at daylighting opportunities in the maintenance shop, which is where they actually spend a lot of their time. And this happened to be a south elevation of this building. And you can just barely see it, but we tried to create a brise soleil. They actually store a lot of pipe on site. And so because we knew that we would need to do some sort of daylighting controls, and it's in a shop, so we're not just going to put up Mecco shades or something like that, we came up with an architectural detail that we thought might work for them. So we just put some steel brackets that stick out of the edge of the side of the building. They can load the pipes up here, and it creates some sort of a daylighting filter to the inside of that space. And then from the top, we had the cantilever that comes out here, and then the daylight can still get in from the top. So it worked out really well. The other thing that we did on this project was we looked at the opportunities for light shelves, and this was the coordination with the mechanical engineer, where we tried to figure out a way to use different types of mechanical ductwork, that instead of building a sheetrock light shelf, we looked at ways to use our ductwork and how could that perform as a light shelf instead of building another material. So thinking about, well, what do we already have in the space, and how can it perform do two things instead of just one? I think that some of the easiest spaces to work in are in the warehouse districts, and this was actually the company that I used to work for, and we had just recently remodeled our office. It's a 100-year-old building. I always think about this when I think about designing new buildings. Are we creating spaces that are still going to be this beautiful 100 years from now? I don't know that people 100 years ago thought that they were going to still be this precious to us today. I'm sure of that. But from a design aesthetic, they're the easiest ones to work in. And you can do really great things for little to no money. The goal of our project was basically to try to figure out how to make sure all employees were adjacent to the windows, so nobody in the office is more than 10 feet away from the glass. Fortunately, though, it's a 10,000 square foot floor plate, so we have glass on 3 sides, so that's relatively easy to accomplish. We put all of the common space in the middle, and then we wanted to make sure that we brought the daylight into the middle. So this was an example where I didn't want sheetrock in this space in particular, because of the fact that we were working in this small space and remodeling it at the same time. So the way that we built this space out was everything on the interior we did with metal studs. We put the metal studs up to define the space, but there was no need for privacy. We already had private conference rooms. So everything in the middle was fair game. We created our charrette space in the middle. We wanted people, we were trying to get people to eavesdrop on each other, so the acoustics was not a priority on this job. What we used as a wall material then was we took metal studs, and then we put on one side of the metal stud we used the polycarbonate, which is just screwed in, and that provided a barrier, but it allowed the daylight to come through. And then being a design firm, we needed a place to actually display our projects. So we just took simple unistrut and put that on the other side of the metal stud and created unistrut rails so that we could just set our work in there. So it kind of, again, did two different things. It allowed us an opportunity to display our work without having to apply a display mechanism to another wall surface, but it also helped to diffuse some of the sunlight that would come in from this side of the space into the center core. Okay. Another example is we designed the ASID office for the Minnesota chapter. It's in another warehouse type building, but in this case we looked at opportunities for the modular idea was important in this case as well, and we needed to meet sustainable design goals, and as you can imagine the clientele was the most difficult clients I've ever had. So thinking about a whole slew of interior designers that are coming from all different angles and what their expectations are of what the space is going to be was very interesting. This space used to be wide open. This storefront was not enclosed. This was just an open space that you could walk through. And it's right on the first floor where there's a lot of traffic. So our modular idea here was to think about ways to create the enclosures without having contractors in the building to do it. So we used a lot of steel and glass, and we had all of the steel panels fabricated in the steel shop, and then we just were able to bring them all in and set them in place. So the work on site was very minimal. It's easy enough to take it back out. We felt that because it is steel, it would be easy to recycle it again, and it fit in with the framework of the industrial warehouse building that this was actually in. The rest of the materials, this was just prior, we did this just prior to where bamboo really became popular. So we did use a bamboo flooring in there to try to expose, again, having kind of the residential designers and the commercial designers. We wanted to make sure that we were exposed to other types of wood flooring options. And then we used a lot of locally harvested wood that came in from Wisconsin, actually, for all of the casework and things that we built. The textiles were, at that time, all recycled content. So it gave us an opportunity to try to teach other interior designers, what can be possible, and that walking into the space, I don't think that most people get the sense that it's a sustainable model or that it's, a green office space, which is also one of my goals, is that I don't think that it should be that obvious to people that you've gone the extra step. You can just see a little bit more of that particular space. The next one that we worked on was for St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church, and this was their parish center. This part that you can see here was actually the addition to the existing building. The existing building was a convent, and there used to be a building right here that was just a one-story building that had to be taken down. This is the adjacent space where they have a school, a Catholic school. The church is more progressive than most Catholic churches, so this is where they actually do their worship space. They have a pretty large congregation of about 1,100 people. And so instead of using the old church, which only holds a couple hundred people, they use their gymnasium for that. And then this is the interior of the office space of the actual parish center. What happened on this project was we did the addition of the gymnasium in 1993 or 4, and we started introducing this parish to the idea of sustainable design. They didn't really know what we were talking about, but they were okay with it. So we didn't do a lot of things, but we did enough. some of the things that we were successful with, which is a minor success, but at the time it seemed to be a big deal. We made sure that we diverted as much of the waste as possible, and I don't remember the exact figure, but it was pretty significant. We diverted it from the landfill partially by using recycling efforts, but the other part of it is this church is right in the middle of a housing neighborhood, so we put a lot of stuff on the curb, and all of it went away. So whether it was cabinets or doors or, I mean, anything that we put on the curb, people came and they took. And so it was kind of a good reminder that, you know, your waste is somebody else's treasure, and you should potentially give them the opportunity to take advantage of that. So we did this. The things that we were not able to do, there used to be a brick wall right here, and we wanted to have the wall deconstructed so that we could then reuse the brick on the outer wall. We were not able to do that. It was too early for I think from that standpoint. The next one is, this was a demonstration project that we did for a nonprofit developer. It's called the Phillips Eco Enterprise Center. It's an office industrial building, 64,000 square feet in total. 20,000 of it is office space only. The idea, it's in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Minneapolis. The nonprofit developer was the Green Institute. Some of you may have heard of this project, and some of you may have actually toured this project. It was one of the first kind of environmental projects in the Twin Cities that came online. And they were willing to try a lot of new technologies, which is really exciting for us. The couple of things that we did on this one, at this point now, getting and using salvaged brick became a whole lot easier. So we have a brick supplier in town. They import the brick from Chicago, and the brick was it's just beautiful. It was easy to use. It was easy to specify. We didn't have to worry about storing it anywhere and going out and finding it. All we had to do was just call up the brick supplier and say that we wanted to have salvaged brick. So it really created a nice aesthetic for this particular building in the neighborhood that it's in. It's right up against, we now have a light rail in Minneapolis that goes right past this building. So we did try to design this because of that. We knew that it would get a lot of attention from people coming in from the airport to downtown. And we wanted to make, you know, as much of an impact at that point as possible. But it's also right in a kind of a residential, retail, industrial kind of area. So we wanted to kind of fit in with that. So this is the actual office portion of the building. Some of the goals that were important besides, well, on the salvage material front were that we needed 25%, we wanted 25% of the overall building materials to actually be salvaged, which I figured out pretty quickly that that's next to impossible. But we did do pretty well. We used the recycled brick, or the salvaged brick, and then one of our architects was reading the classifieds newspaper, and a farmer was trying to unload steel joists, and he just had them sitting out in his farm field. He had intended to build like a Morton building or something like that, never got around to it, wasn't going to do it, but had all the steel joists. So we actually took them in, and of that 40,000 square foot warehouse, half of it uses the salvage joists. And it turned out, it actually went really well. We were able to find a place to store them, which was really the most difficult thing. And we had structural engineers that were able to go out and look at them, and most of the joists were actually in really good shape. So we had a few repairs. We didn't lose any of the joists, and the installation of them went quite smoothly. So the benefit of being able to find them, at that point in time, steel was out 16 weeks for the lead time of steel, and because we found them in the farm field, you know, we were able to keep construction moving as we were waiting for the new joists to actually show up. Another thing that we did on this project was we took, well, here in this lobby, another example of salvaged material. There was a building that was coming down that was made out of heavy timber, and so we went out and we took as much of the wood as possible and used that for, in this main lobby, we actually have a heavy timber structure, and then we used them for the stair treads, which worked out nice as well. So we were able to get that from another local building. On the next slide, we wanted the warehouse space to be 100% daylight. The programming of this particular building was such that they wanted it to be an incubator site. They wanted it had to provide jobs for people in the neighborhood. It was an industrial type building, but the idea was that the 20,000 square foot office space up in the front was really where the office space was supposed to be, and the back of the building, the warehouse piece, was just where they would do their light manufacturing or shipping or whatever they would need to do. What happened, in fact, was tenants moved into the warehouse, but they would do basically their office space and industrial space within the same space versus having it be separate. So the program of the building, we do have all the common spaces. Nobody was allowed to put, their own break room in their tenant space because the building had a common break room. Nobody has bathrooms within their space because we had common bathrooms. So these were things that the developer said, these are just conditions of moving into this building that you'll have to deal with. We did put operable windows in this building, which has turned out to be a bigger deal than I probably would have thought. That it has been one of the greatest selling features of getting tenants to move into the building is the fact that you can open the windows. And I think we all agree with that if you have that opportunity, that's what you want. And why we don't build more buildings with operable windows, I don't know, other than the fact that mechanical engineers have a hard time dealing with it. So I don't know. We have to keep working on that. We did daylighting for the warehouse, like I said, and because it is a warehouse, we had the precast panels. We did do some windows on the perimeter of the building, but because of the depth of the building, we weren't able to draw the daylight in as far as we wanted. So we did try a skylight as an option to solve that problem. This particular skylight I've been very happy with, but this was a good example of a client that's willing to take a risk and deal with the consequences. The reason that this skylight really worked, what it does, these things here are mirrored reflectors. They are not solar. It's not a PV panel or anything. It actually tracks with the sun, and as it brings the light in, then it draws it down into the skylight, which is the pyramid effect, and then it brings the light down into the space. It's the first skylight that I've really seen that doesn't have the glare problems. So it truly feels when you're in the warehouse that you just have a very well lit space from an ambient level. So you don't recognize that it's truly daylight coming in until you really look up at it and recognize that the lights aren't on and it's all coming through the skylights. What happened was we were assured, this is a new product, we were assured that it would be fine in a northern climate. Shortly after it was installed, all of the electrical wires that make this thing spin around are outside, kind of outside the box. So it didn't take very long through the winter where they all stopped working. Okay, no problem. We just called the manufacturers and we said, could you come and fix the skylights? So they came once, then they sold the company. The new company is Japanese. They said, it's not our problem. We said, it is your problem. You've got to do something to fix this. They came back, they fixed them again, and now have come up with a new technology that this portion of the skylight still has the same idea, but the mirrored reflectors are actually now within the bubble. So now they're working just fine. It's a great product, but it was a painful process. And it did cost our client extra money in order to deal with, the product manufacturers. They didn't pay for it just carte blanche. There was a lot of expense that went into that. Behind this, on the upper deck of the office portion of the building, we put in a roof garden. So it was one of the first roof gardens in Minneapolis, which has been very exciting too to be able to show. This building is open. It gives tours all the time. So it's been a building where we can showcase the salvaged material use. We've been able to showcase a good daylighting strategy from an industrial standpoint. We had a roof garden. Even though it's small, it was a roof garden that we can show to different clients to show that it's successful, it's working, understand what the maintenance issues are with that. And now, after this photograph was taken, they have installed a full solar array on that 40,000 square foot roof, and it, to our knowledge, is the largest solar array in the 5-state region. So that, in and of itself, because of the light rail train that goes by there every day, it has raised people's attention to the fact that solar power, people look at it and ask questions, and then they can come and tour it. In the solar panel, all of the electronics of how all of these technologies work is right there front and center. This was also one of the first buildings in the Twin Cities that used geothermal. So there were a lot of questions about that, and our building code official story on this one was we installed waterless urinals and we did geothermal. And the day that the first tenant was going to move in, of course, they did the final CO walkthrough, and the guy said there will be no tenants in this building until you get rid of the waterless urinals and until you put in a furnace. And so there was a lot of last minute 24 hours to bring them to a comfort level. We got rid of the waterless urinals because that was an easy one, and we fought the furnace and helped them understand that we didn't need one. The payback on that geothermal system here was going to be somewhere between 7 and 15 years, depending on energy costs. Because the natural gas prices went up the year after this was built, the payback went down to like 2 or 3 years. So, so the story that it was able to tell was pretty phenomenal, and has been quite successful. Let's see here. I'm going to skip past this one. And then this one is another example. This is a showroom, a product showroom where they sell furniture systems and lighting systems. And I guess, the thing that we did here, it is more of an industrial building like this one that they moved into, so they had a lot of storage in the facility, and then they had their showroom and office space. And again, trying to think about what the aesthetic could be that would meet their needs. And here we looked at opportunities for just taking plain old plywood, instead of using your acoustical ceiling tile as you always would, figuring out a way to use 4x8 sheets of plywood. These happen to be maple, and use that to create a ceiling treatment that is both interesting, easy to remove, different than typical, and kind of plays into the overall industrial concept that we had for the rest of their space. Again, here we left some of the studs exposed. This was not necessarily for the same reason as before, but the wall treatment here is also, on this side, it's plywood. On this side, opposite it, we did steel plates and installed that on the metal studs. So we're trying, again, to figure out how can we apply something to the stud that is easy to remove and still create a nice, warm interior. So thinking about kind of the deconstruction aspects of it, different use of materials, wood being more of a biodegradable material, and then the steel is just easy enough. You can put it up and then take it down. That just, kind of gave us that industrial edge that we were looking for. This is just more of that particular project. We used the polycarbonate again to draw a little bit of daylight in. And you can see that it has an exposed structure throughout most of the space. The next one is an appliance showroom. This one, I think, this one is a very recent project. And this was a typical appliance showroom. If you imagine going to Best Buy or going to Sears to buy appliances, that's kind of what they look like. This is a family-owned business, rows of appliances. They wanted to have a new concept for selling appliances, and they wanted to appeal to designers and architects so that we would bring our clients in there and treat it more like a showroom. So we came up with this idea of creating vignettes throughout the space that people would feel more like they were maybe at home in their kitchen, versus just looking at rows of appliances. Everything with the design concept went well. Each of the vignettes, there's 18 different kitchen vignettes within this space. Each of the vignettes has a different aesthetic. So some of them had wood floors, some had cork floors, some had Cambria type countertop, and some had concrete countertops. The idea was that the client here was very interested in changing her brand identity, changing her image to attract different people to come to her store while still making her regular customers feel very comfortable there. Our goal was to come at this from a sustainable standpoint, knowing that we're going to use, it's a retail space, so it's going to have a short life, and to think about each of the material choices from kind of the sustainable side. And knowing that in this case, the client did not have, she really didn't, she didn't not care, but she didn't care. So the presentation for us was all about knowing that we could have done typical, flashy retail type finishes, and instead we stepped back and only chose things that kind of met our our environmental criteria. So looking at renewable materials, using wood flooring that was either local or came from a sustainably managed forest. And at the end, we told her all of that, and she was very impressed. But she doesn't talk about that when she's telling other people about her new showroom. She knows that it's there. And to me, it just always raises the point that as designers, we make that choice. I have so many people that say, I don't know what to do. I don't know. My clients don't ask me to do it. So I don't. My clients don't want to pay more for it. And the answer is that you are the designer. You are the creative one. You are going to present the palettes to the client, so you make the choice of which palette you're going to show it to them. Do you want one that is more environmentally responsible or not? You are making that choice for them every single time. And most clients would say, from an air quality standpoint, when I step back and say, okay, we just did programming, I know what all your needs are, nobody in the room brought up sustainable design. So do you want to talk about that a little bit? We'll have depending on the client, we'll talk about it for a few minutes. But then we'll get into, what are your priorities here from a workplace standpoint? And as soon as you start asking them about air quality, they all say, well, of course we want good air quality. Therefore, it then becomes our job to be specifying materials that aren't going to be off-gassing these emissions. So it's always a catch-22 where I think we just need to step up and do everything that we can to present it to our client, because that's part of what our responsibility is, I think. So the last project that I want to talk about is another exciting one. This one is under construction at this point. It's for Quality Bicycle Products, and they are the largest bicycle parts distributor in the world. They're located in Bloomington. They have 130,000 square feet existing of office and warehouse space, and our job was to double that square footage. So we designed 135,000 square foot space. 35,000 of that is office space, 35,000 of it is low bay warehouse, and the remainder of it is high bay warehouse. So it's 42 feet tall. The racking on the inside goes to 33 feet. This was another project where we have a 13-acre site. This is the third addition that this client has done to their project, and the first one was in 1996. So this was really the last time that they wanted to be going in with heavy cranes and equipment to build on their site. So our job was to figure out not only to meet their program needs of needing more storage space, but to also look at ways to maximize the amount of building that we can do, and partnering that with the amount of parking that would be required with the amount of square footage that we would be adding. So we looked at a lot of different scenarios of how to put the addition on, and how we could maximize the amount of space that we could use. There was an existing building on the site. They bought an adjacent property. It was 40,000 square feet. So again, one of the first things that we did was we walked through the 40,000 square foot, 14-foot high building to see what we could get out of there that we could use on this project. you have to do it in the beginning because you have to design towards that. So we took all the structural joists, we took the structural columns, it was a concrete block building. We took all the concrete block and had it all crushed so that we could use it for the underlayment of the new parking lot. That was pretty much what we took. And then we opened it up to the employees, and they had their own silent auction. And people from the office came in and started taking the light fixtures. They took all kinds of things. Somebody took the ship's ladder that goes to the roof, which we couldn't use because it's no longer code compliant. But somebody actually took that home to use in their garage or something. So we were pretty pleased with the amount of material that was salvaged. In the end, when the building was torn down, 77% of it was diverted from the landfill. Because we had a pretty large site here, we were able to store our materials, the large structural materials, right on site. So the joists were no problem, and the crushed concrete was no problem. The steel columns, because they were only 14 feet tall, we couldn't use them as columns. We didn't have anything that was 14 feet tall. So we used them for all of the bollards that we needed out in the warehouse and around the perimeter of the building. We just cut them down to the right size, and we had more than enough steel to take care of that. Some of the other things that we looked at, well, as we were trying to figure out how to solve this problem, and we were looking at maximizing the square footage, the original developer had already planned another addition to the office space, and then they had an addition to the warehouse space. And as simple as this idea was, instead of building two additions, we combined it into one, but we took that 40 feet tall space that they didn't need the whole 130,000 square feet of it to be a high bay warehouse, and we split it in half so that we were able to use the upper floor of the warehouse space as office space. And it allowed us to actually build more square footage because the footprint that we would have been allowed would have been much smaller if we had done it the other way, versus if we actually figured out how to reprogram the space that we were going to build, we actually built more square footage than they would have been allowed if we had built it all on the ground. So by putting the office space on the second floor of the warehouse space, we gained more space. We did not have a very healthy budget here because it's primarily a warehouse space, so it also allowed us to spend more money on the office interior than we probably would have been able to if we had built an office addition only on the ground. So we, again, kind of looked at how we can reallocate our funds that were available to us on this project. You can go to the next one. The site, like I said, is 13 acres. On the north side of the site, this is the south edge, the north side of the site abuts a park, a fairly large park that has a lot of bike trails that come through this. Being a bicycle company, a lot of their people actually bicycle to work. We reduced the parking lot by 2/3 because of the fact that most of the employees ride their bike to work, and there's actually a corporate incentive that if you ride your bike to work, then you get so many corporate dollars to buy company product with by riding your bike. So that was easy enough to do. And then we knew that we wanted to manage as much of the stormwater as possible on the site, and especially since it was right up against the park. And the company is really, much more connected to nature than maybe some other companies. They really wanted a beautiful landscape, so they put a lot of money towards the landscaping. We did a lot of rain gardens, and we did the rain gardens within the parking medians. We wanted to do porous paving out in the parking area, but we were not able to do as much as possible because of cost. So what the civil engineer did was he figured out a way to do a 3-foot band in front of the green median between the parking spaces where the rain garden is. As the water whichever direction the water would be flowing, we just did the porous pavers right in front of the rain gardens so that we could actually treat it once through the porous pavers and then let it go onto the rain gardens and then let it go from there into the storm sewer if needed. It was very successful, and it was really exciting to see the whole team come together on how we were going to deal with all of the different issues. From a stormwater management issue, thinking about the landscaping and how it was going to impact from my interior office space, how the employees were going to interact as they came into the site and how they were going to get into the building. this is the portion of the building where the two-story space is, and the upper portion is where the office space is. We were able to site this one in the right direction, so that was a real plus. So it runs, this is the south side, and then the north side is on the opposite side. So we were pretty excited with the amount of daylighting that we were actually able to draw into that space. But it was really tight. So this is 240 feet wide, and our ceilings were 20 feet tall. So we knew right away that we were only going to draw daylight in about 50 feet from each side, and we would still have 100 and some feet left over in the middle that would not be daylit. So we did put in a roof monitor in the middle of the office space to try to draw daylight then in from the north and the south side into the center portion of the space. We coordinated with the team right from the get-go on the furniture systems to make sure that we had appropriate furniture lined up and didn't design something that wouldn't take advantage of the daylight. And then because of the south facade, the facades are different. On the south side we have the solar shading devices, and on the north side we don't. We're also looking at custom designing ways to create window shading devices for the south side that are mobile so that they can move them around as they need them for additional sun shading on that side. And then we also put a park on both the north and south side of the building so that they, on the interior, so that there'll be some of that landscaping we brought to the inside, again, to kind of filter some of the light that would be coming in, and we could pull the actual workspace off of the windows so that nobody would actually have too much daylight at the workspace. So our time is up, and thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, I would be more than happy to answer them, and I also have business cards if anybody would like to talk to me at some other time as well. So thank you.